Zsolt Darvas. I'm a senior fellow at Bruegel, and I'm really pleased and honored to chair this discussion with Secretary General Angel Gurria and two other OECD colleagues, with Aida, Caldera-Sanchez and Pierre Bayet, on the EU and on the Euro area report of the OECD. The OECD has these reports in every second year, and they have just published it today, and they have launched it here at our event at Bruegel, which is a very topical issue. Both are very topical issue. You can find some copies outside, but of course you can also download it from the OECD website. And I think, this time is especially relevant that we talk about both the European Union and the Euro area, not least because in the EU we face some major challenges. Even though economic recovery has resumed, we see some major challenges like Brexit. We have a major productivity problem. We have issues on the labor market. We have issues with migration. We have issues with structural reforms. And the EU report covers these and many other interesting areas. In the Euro area, again, beyond the economic outlook and the moderation or the exit from the very expensive monetary policies of the ECB, we also see a moment of change now, whereby some key reforms about the Euro area might be decided in the coming days or weeks or months, who knows. So I think it's exactly the right time to discuss all of these issues. Some proposals certainly are bolder and more ambitious, some are more realistic, and I think the OECD put together some great work to finding a balance between ambition and realism. So we're extremely pleased to host Secretary General Angel Gurria today, who will introduce these reforms. I think he doesn't need any introduction. He has been the Secretary General since 2006, so quite some time, and I think in this period you really shaped your institutions and raised its standing to very, very high level. So we're very pleased and honored to have you here today. So let me now invite you to give some initial remarks, and then we will have a panel discussion, and then I will open the floor for questions and comments.
Well, thank you very much. Delighted to be in Bruegel to launch the economic surveys of both the European Union and the Euro area. The distinction sometimes is a little artificial. It's a little strange that we present two books, on the same day about one area which is contained in the other area. But this is the way the European Commission prefers, and also the Eurogroup, and it seems to be more useful for them. So we do what is more useful for the client. Now, after years of crisis, growth in the EU has picked up momentum. We're projecting 2.3% in this year, more or less, maybe a little bit less, 2.1 or something like that next year. So EU-wide unemployment 7.1. That's below its pre-crisis low. And although unemployment rates remain above the pre-crisis levels in countries like Greece, Spain, and Italy, which are still recovering, but in which all the numbers also look better, but the process just taking a little longer. The improvement in economic conditions, certainly welcome news, but of course, no room to be complacent. There are a number of downside risks. A continuation of growth in the near term, for one thing, cannot be taken for granted. Trade tensions have already dented the business confidence, and these trade tensions, as we saw yesterday, can escalate. In fact, they are escalating. We started with steel and aluminum, and the deferral, and another 30-day deferral or whatever, and then as we were in the middle of the ministerial council meeting of the OECD, we were discussing trade and all the wonderful possibilities that trade provided to create well-being, etc. We were then told that they were putting on the tariffs, you know. So it was a rare privilege to be in the middle of the meeting. And with the Chateau de la Muette in the back, as if we had inspired the tariffs, you know. There was now, what can I tell you? It creates uncertainty. Uncertainty makes policy decisions and economic decisions and investment decisions and consumption decisions to be deferred. And the deferral of these consumption and investment decisions slows down the growth. So basically, forget about the ethical and the moral and the jobs and the investments. It's basically also about jobs, about recovery. And it's as we are waiting for the recovery to kind of catch up, you know, to get some traction, just at the time when we would need more projection and more promotion, etc. And then we get these tensions. Now, Europe is also aging rapidly, and productivity growth is weak. This constitutes a key medium-term challenge. I have to say, everywhere, productivity is weakening. In the OECD in general, we had upwards of 2% productivity growth in the decade of 97 to 2007. And now from 2007 to 2017, it's been under 1%, and in the euro area in the last few years, it's been under 0.5%. So you basically are seeing a very, very serious deterioration in productivity growth. And that, of course, is a big, big challenge. Our surveys on the EU and the euro area identify ways in which we could make the euro area less vulnerable and strengthen what I would call the cohesion of the EU project, which basically means more Europe, more Europe, more Europe. And I can say this as a non-European. I just came back from the parliament a minute ago, where we were talking with the Econ in the parliament, and we were saying, you know, the problem with Europe is the scaffolding. So you save for 3 years to go to Europe one day. If you know you're a Mexican middle class, you finally make it to Europe, and you go to Notre Dame, or you go to Il Duomo in Milan, or you go in Cologne, and you find that it's covered with a black tarpaulin. You know, the scaffolding is, and you can't see the light, and you cannot see the vitrals, and there's noise, and bzzz, you know, they're cleaning the thing, and you are so disappointed. But then you come 3 years later, and it's awesome. You know, this is Europe. You know, I said you can be accused of many things, but not of being too fast. But at the same time, the construction of Europe is always work in progress. The institutions of Europe are always being built. They're always being strengthened. The design of Europe is always being updated, upgraded, modernized. So basically, what you have is this very inspirational, very inspired, and very ambitious work in progress. And, well, sometimes it works better than others, and sometimes it moves faster than others. But it is still the most important integration process that we've ever seen. And it is the one that responded to our collective history in the last 100 years, and therefore of enormous consequence. And that is why we, from the OECD, 2/3 of our membership are Europeans, you know, give a lot of importance to things Europe or Europeans or Eurozone, etc., that we're looking at. Now, what do our reports say? Well, we survived the crisis. A lot of people were saying the demise, you know, this improved the functioning, but there's certain signs of fragility of the common currency. We have to complete the banking union. We need a fiscal backstop for the Single Resolution Fund. European Monetary Fund? Perhaps. But why call it like that? I mean, it looks like a provocation. You already have institutions that help countries get out of trouble, and you call it in not very attractive ways of the European Stability Mechanism. They say two long names, but it's not. No, I just say because the European Monetary Fund looks like it's a competition to the International Monetary Fund when it's basically a complement, and I'm sure that the IMF itself would be very happy to get a little bit of help to support their endeavors. But so we need to reinforce the guarantee of bank deposits. So there needs to be a European deposit insurance. We need to break the negative feedback loop between banks and their states. So the creation of what I would call a kind of a safe asset, where these banks could actually have investments and buy bonds, etc. But also that you do not have too much exposure to a single country. Because why? Because banks tend to buy the bonds of their own country. And the problem is that they end up with very high exposures, and therefore high vulnerabilities to their own country. And how do you make that for a broader sharing of the risk? The second thing is about how do we avoid, or if inevitable, how do we get less impact from future crises? Mario Draghi said whatever it takes, which gave a lot of confidence to the markets. But the problem is monetary policy cannot do the trick by itself. And second, we certainly have run out of a lot of room now after monetary policy has done a lot of good. And I'm the first one to say, let's do a statue to the central banker, whoever the central bank looks like. I suppose a combination of Bernanke and Janet Yellen and Jay Powell and Mario Draghi. That's going to be difficult to merge, right? But the central bankers have done a wonderful job. The problem is they've done a wonderful job with central banking, which is what they do. But the problem is, how do you move from central banking to structural change when monetary policy is already in reverse, where fiscal policy has a lot of limitations because of the question of, you want to reduce deficits, you want to reduce the size of the debt, and you want to bring it down, debt to GDP. The markets are more demanding all the time. They're getting tougher. And the markets are starting, which is probably good, to discriminate better in terms of risk. So if you have a situation like that, what do? Go structural, go structural, go structural. And of course, go national, go national, go national. So going structural, what does it mean? Well, it means education, innovation, regulations, competition. It means flexibility in the labor market, flexibility in the product markets. It means, R&D. It means the universities, the financial system. These are the kinds of things that are going to keep the thing going in the medium and long term. And there's, of course, the integration in the capital markets. I have a statistics here that says that outstanding corporate bonds in the European Union are about 10% of GDP. Bonds, corporate bonds, European Union, 10% GDP. Corporate bonds, United States, 40% of GDP. So you could say the deepening of institutional credit markets in the United States, 4 times as much. Well, because we know, with the universal banking model in Europe, it's mostly the banks do a lot of the work, but basically that means there's a lot of development of capital markets that can still be done, the deepening, and that still is a potential. Now, productivity, again, productivity. Barriers and services, energy, transport, digital markets, barriers of entry, barriers of exit, the churn, which means birth of companies and death of companies, is slowing down. That means less vibrant markets. Too many zombie companies that are preserved too long by the banks who just roll over the loans, and not too many new companies. Why is this serious? Because zombie companies misallocate resources, but who creates the jobs? New companies. In fact, think of what happens when there are some of these mega mergers. You know, the first thing the two chairs or the one who bought the other one announces is synergy, which means I'm going to fire 20,000 workers, you know, from the companies all over the world, and they're going to save $2 billion of, you know, of salaries and whatever, and then it's going to be even more, and then they're going to, these are the kinds of, so where do you create the jobs? In the new companies. And the new companies mostly are small, medium, startup, etc. So there has to be this churn, this vibrancy in the markets. The regulatory burdens are crucial. When you're talking about energy sector, when you talk about electricity, when you talk about things like telecom, etc., you're basically talking regulatory cross-border. There's still small units of business all over Europe instead of one single integrated. That will really give you the power and the technology and the big investment and the economies of scale, etc. So that still has to be done. But also, 40% of the European adults still lack digital skills. Okay, so you have underdevelopment of the capital markets, you have underinvestment, you have underskilling. So all these things add up to productivity. So they're very specific. So no surprises here, you know, because we were talking about productivity like an umbrella. But when you look at the components, then, well, you see that they're underperforming. What about the EU budget? Well, we have a graph here that basically says it's going down in real terms. It's 1.1 or going to 1.0, maybe under the 1% now. And they're asking for one to go up to 1.3. We support the broader, stronger, somewhat broader, somewhat stronger. It's still, it doesn't even look in the graph, it's flat. It doesn't come out in the flat. I mean, 1% in the graph. You really have to make very, very detailed graphs. The scale of the graph has to be very, small. So why? Because you really are, and you're asking more and more things from the Commission and from the Union. And at the same time, they're not being provided. So it sounds like the discussion of my budget at the OECD, or maybe your budget here at Bruegel, where the donors, the ones who contribute, tell you that you should do more and more things, but they don't give you more money. So we support it. It's as I said, about 1%. And reforming the budget has become even more urgent with the Brexit because that's a 7% gap. And that is going to be difficult to compensate. There's also R&D. The Commission should do more R&D. And there's some room also to reallocate. I would reallocate common agricultural policy funds, for example, to digital and structural changes. Please don't tell anybody this from the agricultural. But also I would allocate resources to the lagging regions. to the question of making Europe more equal in the regions, in the different parts. You have countries where only 100 kilometers away, 200 kilometers away, there's a whole difference in terms of, in terms of the level of development, the level of the quality of education, the quality of healthcare, the access, the connectivity, etc. It's not only about the roads. You spend a lot of money on roads, probably too many roads around, but at least in the main cities, etc. The problem is now you have to build other types of roads, so the electronic roads, the virtual roads for the what is it, Industrie 4.0. Huh? So I hope that came out natural. Then the mobility of workers, that's a very crucial question. Also, what workers do is, in the United States, it's almost like you live in Houston, they give you a job in Cleveland, there you go, you sell your house, and then you buy another one there, or you cancel your rent, you go to another one, you take the bus or you take the plane, whatever, and then you go and rent another one. It's a very dynamic market. Here, the housing market is much less dynamic, and that also creates a much less mobility in terms of the, I said about the regional divides. This is a very important issue because 1/3 of the funding of Europe is about the regions. That's big. Well, it's big when it was a small budget. Small, but it's a very large percentage. But the question is, are they allocated well? Is it dedicated to the right kinds of things? Or is it most to physical issues rather than the preparedness of the people, the workforce, the skills, etc.? So, dear friends, the future is becoming increasingly uncertain, but Europe has shown its capacity to survive difficulties by jumping ahead when needed. So let me finish with a short story. I was only 17, 18 years old, and I was working, because in Mexico it's not uncommon, at least in that generation, that we would work and study at the same time. And I was beginning my economic studies in the National University of Mexico. And I was working in the Federal Electricity Commission of Mexico. The Federal Electricity Commission was very modern in the sense that it was funding itself with World Bank loans, but it was also funding itself with bond issues. This is 50 years ago. I was precocious, by the way. It's not that I'm so old. But 50 years ago, the unit, the money, was European units of account. Bond issues were being issued in the remote place that was Mexico 50 years ago. Today we're better, no, because we beat Germany day before yesterday, or whatever, But regardless of that, 50 years ago, not so famous, and this is one agency of the Mexican government issuing bonds in European units of account way before the ECU and way before the EMU and way before this. And already there was an attempt to create what was then a virtual currency. You had to calculate the interest payments without machines like today in 14 different currencies in order to, because they're all weighted. And of course the Deutschmark was the big guy. The French franc and everything had to be calculated. But the point is, there was already 50 years ago. I mean, the euro is a youngster, it's a teenager. But 50 years ago, there was the attempt to create a single currency. So this is why I say you cannot accuse the Europeans of being too fast. They take their time, but when they're done, it's awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Secretary General.
Now all the difficult questions will be
For this-
will be answered by Pierre and Aida.
For this very insightful. I will ask the difficult questions from your colleagues, but I will also like to rely on your wisdom and ask a question from you.
Please.
In fact, two. One on the euro and one on structural reforms. Now, on the euro, you described also many different options for completing the monetary union and said that more Europe, more Europe, more Europe is what needed, and also the report has a number of details. But if you would advise European leaders what should be the priority for the reform of the euro area, what elements of the euro reform would you put to the first places?
Well, first of all, what created the crisis? It was the banks, the financial sector. So I think, although it was in a way imported, what happened is that in the end, look at what has happened. The Americans were a lot more decisive in curing the problems. The Americans were more decisive and they threw much bigger amounts of money to the banks and they consolidated, etc. And now you have probably a too big to fail problem again, or bigger ones. But the banks are about roughly 10 times more capitalized. And you basically still in Europe are facing some cases of undercapitalization or not full capitalization. And then you still have some, I would say, regional cases, because we took care of UniCredit through the market. Monte dei Paschi di Siena was negotiated with the European Union in the form of a precautionary capitalization, which hopefully will be temporary. Hopefully, in the end, Italy will make money, because if you buy when it's low and you sell when it's better, well. But then they found that they had these regional banks, Vicenza, Veneto, etc., which are going to cost them. And the question is, where do you put the deficit and all that? It's a negotiation with the European Union. But then you have Portugal, which again, because of Spirito Santo and other. So you have non-performing loan issues still in what I would say in rather distinct, very well located countries. And therefore, it's not any longer a systemic issue, I would say. But I would take care of those. I would stabilize. In Spain, we have a very good example. They bit the bullet, and they used. I think they made available 100 billion. They used 60 billion. Now they're paying it back, and it worked. The banking system stabilized, and so I'd say the banking system, the financial system, is very crucial. Better regulation, better supervision, but then the question of integration. I mentioned some of the mechanisms, the stabilization mechanism, the guarantees mechanism, that the resolution mechanisms, etc. And you guys chip in if I'm leaving something out. Then the question, of course, of the productivity. The productivity is a combination, as I said, of investment, skills, regulation, and then the governance, of institutions, etc. So, it has proven very difficult to turn it around. It's just been coming down, and it's been very difficult. Well, what do you do then to take the parts? What do you do to revive investment? That's directly related to confidence, but it's also directly related to the regulatory atmosphere, the facilities, the availability of finance, etc. What do you do to deal with the skills? That's a medium-term problem. What you have, if 40% of the people in Europe, of the workforce in Europe, is found not to have the necessary skills in order to match the demand of the markets, it means that a lot of the people who are working today, because you don't have 40% unemployment, are either overqualified or underqualified. And our calculation is that about a third of the people feel very uncomfortable in a heavily digitalized environment. That has to be addressed. And the other question is this digitalization, where you really have to go. Remember, it's not about taxing the digitals, the GAFAs. It's about an increasingly digitalized world, taking advantage to the greatest possible extent of the possibilities. And then I would say, last but not least, all of these things have to be done in a context in which it is inclusive. Now, this is not a moral Pollyanna, saying, oh, let it be inclusive, let it be nice, let it be, morally correct, it's ethically correct. Yeah, all that is true. But it's also economically indispensable because, and it's politically crucial. Why did we take 7 months in forming a government in the Netherlands? 5 months, of all places, 5 months to create a government in Germany. The latest results in Italy, the fragmentation in Spain, the results in Austria, okay? Just take a look at the whole thing, huh? And then you see, it means Brexit. There are a bunch of angry people out there, mostly young people, who are saying, this is not working for me. And I think this is the greatest single threat that we are facing. And I say we, because that means I always speak as we when I speak about Europe, so they think I'm European. Well, they don't think I'm European, but they say, why does he speak of we? Because I like the Pope, but it's a we believe that, but basically because, this is our context, but basically, this is the greatest concern. People are angry, and they are producing these electoral results, and they are fragmenting the political landscape, and this is resulting in very weak, fragile, unstable coalitions. It is affecting the quality of the governance, and therefore affecting the capacity of even the most enlightened leaders, even the most courageous leaders, to take the necessary decisions. Why? Because we saw it yesterday with Angela Merkel. She stood strong on a policy of migration, which was then rejected by her own CSU, coalition member. And, that's as close as it can get, CDU, CSU. But what happens there? Well, the fact is that she is going to have to negotiate, and she was given like 2 weeks, so say, 2 weeks, So the question is, Mr. Rutte, Rutte was a fine leader. He took his country to a very good results. 2 parties formed a coalition. Now he needs 4. And he took 7 months to form a coalition, to agree on a program of work. You're talking about increasingly difficult possibilities of creating coalitions, and therefore more fragile and more unstable, more, as I said, affecting the capacity of decisions. These are the consequences. This is not theoretical. This question of the fragmentation and of leaving people behind. It's not to make op-eds. It's affecting our governance.
On that point, how to change that? So I think many people in this room share your assessment that indeed there are many people who are left behind even in Europe, which is probably one of the most equal part of the world. But what can we do about it? So how can governments, migration is one issue. Certainly migration policies, as you mentioned, was a major factor in Germany, perhaps in other countries. Now, European Council is working on that. But if you go back deeper to inequalities, so what can governments do to reduce the number of angry people?
Well, basically, as I said before, I think the central bankers did what they could to get back the economy on its feet. Then limited room for the fiscal people, for the ministers of finance. But there is some room that they could use because they're paying less interest because of very low interest rates. So there's some room they could use without increasing the deficits. But mostly they have to go structural, they have to go structural, they have to go structural. And there's one problem with structural. It takes time. Germany is still enjoying the benefits of the Hartz reforms by Schröder. I mean, that was 14 years ago, 15 years ago. And they decided to go for a balanced budget plus minus 0.35 in 2009, in the middle of the crisis. I mean, you had to admire the Germans, you know, they got guts. In the middle of the crisis, when everybody was saying, spend more, spend more, spend more, they decided to go with a balanced budget, except they decided to go with a balanced budget in 2016. But they've been moving in the direction of the balanced budget, and then they achieved the balanced budget. And now they're going for the Linder 2020. But what I mean is that you have to give these signals, over a relatively long period. But at the same time, you have to deal with what are called phenomena that are not necessarily economic in nature. You also have to deal with psychology. You have to deal with expectations. And then you have to deal with what are the issues at hand? Well, you have taxes that you can use. You can level the playing field when it comes to outcomes and when it comes to inequality, inclusive growth. You can help with a very targeted and good skills program. I'll give you an example. The French have 32 billion in their budget already. They don't have to create the money to create skills and to activation, active labor market policies, etc. The only problem is that this is not creating any new jobs because it's already been kind of allocated to the ones who already have it, and they're keeping it, and they're very cozy, thank you very much, to it. So you need to kind of shake up the tree and reallocate that. But already there is a very large amount of the budget, you can help. And then there are the reforms. I mean, the reforms, as I said. Hartz, Germany, Schröder, frankly, I don't, it's not true that it's because of that he lost the job. It's just already he had 1% only margin in the last election. So maybe it was his turn to change, whatever it was. But anyway, they're still enjoying that. What about Spain? Well, 6 years ago, they took some decisions. And since 3 years ago, they've been creating 500,000 jobs per year. Then what about Italy? 3 years ago, they took the decision. Renzi, the Jobs Act, l'articolo 18. And they've created about 1 million jobs since. And what about France? They didn't take the reform. They only took it now. They're going to have to wait a little bit. Already there's a bonus in the confidence, but we still have to see, in the end, because it's also about implementation. It's not just about the law being put on the books. And also you have to be careful because the legislative dentists then come. You have a very good law, and you're in the implementation system, and the dentist goes, and then you have no good, So you have to be aware of the legislative dentists coming to town. They come in the middle of the night and take away the teeth. in the form of, some of the left wing, right wing, whatever, every wing, no wings, or too many wings, or there you have the private sector or whatever, or the unions. They all have their own interests, and they all love to keep the privileges. And if there's going to be structural reform, let it be on the cows of my neighbor, as they say. But that's not possible. Everybody has to share in these reforms, especially when you have a problem of sharing the wealth and sharing in the solutions. The problem we have in Europe with an aging society, with more and more of the budgets that is going to be consumed by taking care of the aging, with more and more that is going to be consumed by just the natural evolution of a more demanding society, etc., is that, of course, we have to find ways in which we have to generate more wealth, and we have to get more people to work, the women to work, the youth to work, etc. We really, we can't just be talking about what's going on in Japan and Korea, because that is the mirror in which we have to look at ourselves here and here, because that is exactly what's going to happen to us.
Thank you very much for your very insightful answers.
I don't want to sound pessimistic, and I don't want to sound optimistic either. I just want to sound activistic. So push everybody to action.
Now let's talk about two specific issues before I open the floor with your colleagues on some of the specifics. And maybe we start with the monetary union with Pierre Beynet, who is a head of division at the OECD Economics Department. So one of the proposals which included in the report is the common European unemployment reinsurance system. So could you describe briefly, and I would intentionally look at my watch because I would like to offer the opportunity to everyone to ask questions, what is indeed the proposal itself, how it would avoid the typical problems which is mentioned, for example, permanent transfers from let's say Germany to Italy, which is sometimes feared, and how can be it introduced?
Okay, does it work? Yeah. Thank you very much. So just maybe the starting point where we come from, in the Euro area report, the main issue we have is like how to avoid the next crisis. The crisis will come one day in the euro for sure. There will be a next crisis, but how to avoid that it destroys the euro area. And so the starting point is like, what can be done next time there is a big crisis? Can we count on domestic fiscal policy, a national fiscal policy? Now the debt level is very high, and it's going down progressively only. So we have a very strong, key recommendation in our report that countries should really use the good time now to try to reduce debt as fast as possible without derailing the recovery, so that we have some margin next time the crisis hits to increase the deficit and support the economy. But this will be, we believe, quite limited. We have the monetary policy. We said that it's overburdened. So we don't believe, maybe the ECB will start normalizing at one point, but maybe by the time the next crisis hits, it will not be in a situation where the ECB could again give so much boost to the economy as it did last time. And then we have the private sector, which is also helping in case of big crisis. We saw like a lot of unemployed in Spain, in Germany, in Italy. They are moving in place where there are more dynamism, so there are a lot of these people going to Germany. So it's kind of a private natural solidarity, but it's also limited in Europe. People don't move that much. We mentioned the capital markets that are not so developed. So that's why we thought we need another instrument. And this other instrument has been proposed not just by us. It's like an idea that is up in the air for some time. And the IMF had a proposal. The Commission had a proposal just recently about an investment protection fund. And we have our proposal also. So it's just showing different kind of proposals, which is focusing more on unemployment benefit reinsurance scheme. And so maybe I can show just a few slides to describe, if I can take to describe how it could work. I don't know if somebody can put the PowerPoint, otherwise I will explain with the PowerPoint, but if there is...
Just explain.
Yeah, I just explain them. So those who took the PowerPoint presentation, there is at least one there. the idea is like unemployment is a.
You want to?
No, I don't need it. Thank you. Yeah, this one. Maybe for those who have it, I can tell you which. Okay, good.
Oh, you got it.
I just need to talk a bit more and then it comes. Okay, so how does it work? This? Okay. Okay. So the idea is like during the crisis, I mean, we want also Europe to be closer to people. So that's also why we focus on unemployment reinsurance scheme. So we want for jobless people to benefit from more solidarity. And we also believe that this kind of spending, the impact on the activity is very high because jobless people tend to be people who have like a difficulty to live, of course. And so if you give them more money, they will spend it. It's good for growth. And so what we propose is a scheme because we don't want also to harmonize, because each country can have different way of dealing with their labor market. We don't want to create permanent transfer between countries because we know that it will be difficult for some country to accept. So that's why our scheme is like a reinsurance scheme. So basically, if a country is hit by a big shock, so it will work only in the scheme we are simulating. It's some parameter we decide. I mean, it's just to illustrate how it would work. It's not like the parameter I would mention are not what we really propose to be put in place in reality, but just give an idea of how it could work and what could be the benefit. So we would say, like, if a country has like unemployment above a long-term average and also increasing above a certain threshold, so we don't want for small increase of unemployment the scheme to be activated, so it has to be for big shock, they will get 1% of GDP transfer. So actually what we decided, I mean, when you simulate, is like you have an increase of unemployment of 1 percentage point, you will get 1% percentage of GDP of help from this scheme. So it's quite big. And you can see in this first figure I'm going to show, I have 4 slides, so it will be relatively quick. So you can see that in 2009, you had the big shock. So the line in blue is what really happened to GDP. And with our scheme, you can see that the impact of the shock overall for the full euro area was much smaller, like about 1% less. In the second crisis, in 2011, 2012, and up to 13, when we had the double depreciation in Europe, you can see again the green line, which is above the blue line. So the scheme is very good at smoothing activity. And of course, later, growth will be a bit smaller because the purpose of this scheme is not to be in permanent deficit, is not to lead to any transfer. So there is a mechanism in our scheme to repay. So once a country gets money, then the other country, after it reaches a certain amount of deficit, they will start to repay. And actually, also because we don't want country to abuse the scheme, we have also some kind of penalties for countries that draw too many times, then they will start to repay a bit more than the countries that never draw. So what does it... Okay. So the question next is like, some countries will say, okay, it's always, we know the culprit, it will only be like the countries that used to be in trouble, like some call the Club Med, in a bit pejorative way, that will get the money. And what is interesting in our scheme, you can see in these figures, is that all countries will benefit from it. So of course, you can see on the left, that is mainly Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Greece, that in our simulation got the biggest amount of money, 5% of GDP. By the way, why 5% of GDP? Because in our scheme, we decided to cap the amount so that it doesn't get too high. On the right, sorry, yeah, on the right. On the right of the graph. But in the middle, you already have Netherlands, which is getting as much as Italy. And then you have Germany, which is getting almost 3% of GDP. And then even further on the left, you have also Finland, which is getting 1% of GDP. This is the total amount during the period when we simulated this scheme. So we started in 2002. We did it retroactively to see what would have happened from 2002 to 2016. So during this period, we had 2 big crises. I mean, we have the recession of 2003, and then we have later 2003, 2004, and then we have the Great Recession. And we can see that all European countries would have benefited from this scheme. Now, the period of time when they would have benefited of this scheme would have been quite different. So this is a selection of the countries. So you can see that Germany would have benefited mainly at the beginning, in 2004. if you remember, that was the time was France, Germany, and Luxembourg got allied to get rid of the fiscal stability of the whole of the pact to get an exemption. And but at that time, Germany would have got big support from this scheme. And if you look at the blue line of Germany, if you go completely on the right, you can see that the money that Germany would have got in 2004 would have been repaid by now. Spain would have got a lot of money very quickly, and that's also a bit of the feature of the labor market in Spain. I mean, unemployment, Spain has a very flexible, because they rely a lot of short-term contracts, so unemployment is really jumping very quickly. So Spain would have got money much faster than Italy. So if you look at Spain compared to Italy, Italy is a green line. Italy would have got money much later. And then Spain, you can see, is capped at 5% because this is a feature we put in the scheme to avoid that a country gets too much. So I didn't show Portugal, but Portugal would have been capped also. And you can see then Austria, which is a dotted line, as another example of a country which would have drawn from the scheme several times during the big recession and also before, and then go back progressively to zero. And overall, just to finish the first summary of this work, which should be published in July, so those interested can look at the working paper when it gets published. You can see that the fund is going into negative, of course, because during this period we had two big crises. So, but the deficit of this fund would be only 2%. I mean, some say that 2% is big, but it's overall, if you look at, I mean, it's not huge. I mean, it's not something that Europe cannot afford to finance. And every time after a crisis, the fund returned progressively to zero. So you can see in 2004, 2005, and 2013, it goes back. So it's still, in the simulation, it's still -1. Of course, it's not back to an equilibrium, but this was an exceptional crisis. So except if you keep having this kind of very big crisis, it will be... So it's financed by borrowing. And then... So the mechanism, the scheme is a fund that could borrow money.
Issue bonds like
it could issue bonds. It could be maybe useful also if you want to create a European bonds later. But and then once it's but it there are also contribution from countries so both mechanism works. So it's financed by borrowing, but at the beginning especially, but then country pay back.
Budget.
Yeah, exactly. Because the way, I mean, I don't want to enter too much into technicalities, but the way we did it, initially the fund has no money, and country don't contribute if there is no event. So the fund is basically inactive if there is no recession. As soon as there is a recession, they get money, the fund borrows, and then the countries start paying back later. That's
okay.
That's it.
I mean, I very much like the idea of borrowing because I think that's clearly necessary if you want an effective fund. And this idea is also, I think, relatively straightforward and might help its acceptance that there is no cross-country transfers in the long term. Now, very, very shortly to Aida Caldera, who's a senior economist at the OECD Economics Department, but I have to mention that she was a research assistant at Bruegel in 2007. So
nobody's perfect.
I'm very pleased to have you here again. So on just one question on the EU budget and the regional funds. Also, Secretary General mentioned that this is a time of reforming the funds, and he also highlighted the importance of supporting the poorer regions in Europe. So one question is clearly whether the existing policy of cohesion policy, how effective it was according to your assessment. I mean, I read many papers, and I have to say I find very different outcomes. So some say that there's a big effect, especially if we simulate the model. If more empirical studies typically find, I think that the impact is more questionable. Some find that the impact is only lasts for the short term, but vanishes after, so it doesn't raise the long-term level or growth. So one issue, and certainly the crucial issue since you had the negotiations, how to reform, how to change it.
So maybe I just wanted to show one slide to motivate why this is important. So if I can get up my own slides here.
I'm sure the slides will come.
Okay, because as I think what is important to realize is that Europe is now growing, but we are not growing together in the sense that the crisis not only reduced the convergence across countries, but also reduced the convergence among regions. So while until the financial crisis we could see that disparities in GDP per capita across European regions were falling, now after the crisis they are starting to diverge again. So that's why it is important to now, the discussion on the budget gives us an opportunity to rethink the cohesion policy, but also very topical because we see these deep divergences increasing. And now you were asking, as the Secretary General said, regional policy absorbs a substantial amount of money from the budget. It's about 1/3. You very well said that there are many studies that looked at the impact of the structural funds, and I have to say that the results are quite mixed. So yes, they have contributed to convergence, but sufficiently so, given the amount of money that are being dedicated to this? Well, the question is out there. So in the report, what we propose is that we need to rethink cohesion policy. Going forward, there's going to be less money, possibly, for a regional policy because we will have to, there are other priorities that need to be financed. We have migration, we have other issues on the defense, other issues on the table. So the important thing in view of this increasing divergence is that regions that are lagging behind should receive most of the funding. At the moment, this is not the case. About 25% of cohesion spending is going to relatively richer regions. So we think that the money should go to the regions that need it most. And then in terms of the targeting of spending. So at the moment, money is true that it's mostly allocated to growth-enhancing policies, but is it also true that it's very much dispersed in the sense that cohesion policy has many objectives, including climate change, including greening the economy. Those are important challenges, but they should be, they should be managed through another tool. Regional policies should be dedicated to fostering convergence across regions. So most of the money should go to investment in education, in innovation, in cross-border linkages, which are the policies that are going to foster long-term growth. And then in terms of spending, there's the question of whether spending is always done with an economic rationale in mind. So what we see is that spending typically takes quite some time for the structural funds to be spent. Typically, that most is spent at the end of the funding period, so at the end of the 7 years, and there's a rush to spend the money without perhaps not looking so carefully at how the money is spent. So here we think that it would be important to consider whether there's a need to increase the co-financing by countries, by member states, so they pay more attention to how the money is spent. And then another message that I think, as you were saying, it's important that we know whether the policy is delivering. I think it's important that there's more analysis on how the money is spent, and also to recognize that there are mistakes in the way how the money is spent. I mean, it's not always done in the best way. So in some cases, there's lack of competition in the attribution of the funds, and there should be a strengthening of the capacity, of the capacity of the member states to allocate the money.
Implementation errors found the European Court of Auditors.
So these are
29% serious, 49% significant, and 22% minor errors. The problem with this is not that they're errors. People err, people make mistakes. The problem is that this is used to then have a kind of excuses by countries not to provide the necessary support. So you get a copy because I see that you would like to have a copy. You're complaining that you don't have a copy, so you too, you get a copy of this. Okay.
I think there are some other copies outside as well. So.
Yeah, well, maybe they ran out.
Okay, so if I would try to translate your assessment to an evaluation of the Commission proposal, Some aspects you probably welcome, for example, the increase in national co-financing, but some aspects you probably don't welcome, namely that they continue to want to use this policy also for the most developed regions, and also that they wish to include not just GDP per capita as a key indicator, but also like climate change and other indicators. As you said, they should be, in principle, should be financed from other funds. But now let me open the floor now for questions and comments. We still have half an hour. So if you would like to ask a question or comment, please raise your hand. I ask you to first briefly introduce yourself and also try to have your comment or question rather brief if possible.
Sure.
Kaiser from Backbone Consulting in Germany. Mr. Secretary General, it was fascinating to listen to you. You spoke about trade, but you did not mention WTO. All the discussions we have about WTO, can they have the effect that the importance of your organization will grow as far as trade is concerned? Thank you.
We are very happy to work with the WTO and for the WTO. They are responsible of the trade discussions. They are the place where the appellate court exists. When it comes to trade, we have a trade committee. We have created the global value chain concept in terms of looking at the micro numbers of the global value chains. We have created and discovered, not discovered, but necessarily put numbers, values on the trade in value added flows. Today we can calculate the flows up to 2015. I think we're going to come out with numbers for 2016 very soon. This is massive number crunching. This is why we're talking about 2 years behind or a little bit like that. But this is with numbers from 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, 30,000 companies. So we're no longer talking about macroeconomic numbers and national accounts analysis. We're talking about micro numbers. And basically, what you have is that, global value chains, trade and value added services, STRI, the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. We created that. And we actually can give the German Minister of the Economy, Mr. Altmaier, we can give it to the Australian Minister of Finance, we can give it to the Turkish Minister of Economy, we can give it to the Mexican Minister of the Economy, one page saying, these are the 20 sectors, and this is how good you are on those 20 sector services. This is the average for the OECD. Are you below or above the average? And this is the best performer in each sector. Are you above or, below the best performer? So if you are above the average, you can move to the average. That's a policy decision. If you are, but also, are you restrictive in couriers? Or are you restrictive in allowing lawyers? Or are you restricting allowing doctors? Or are you restrictive in allowing railways? It's not the same, okay? And so basically services and then trade facilitation indicators. Trade facilitation was signed in Bali. It was the only thing that happened there, and we haven't had too many things happen at the WTO since because of the members, nothing with the WTO. So what happened? Well, we now have indicators because if we cannot measure it, we cannot manage it. So what are we doing with the WTO and for the WTO? Doing the analytical and numbers and number crunching and doing things that will help them. I like to say, this is when we talk about the structural, the sustainable development goals or the climate. We aspire to the Oscar. We want to get the Oscar for, but there's a best movie, best director, best actress, but there's also best supporting cast. Huh? And we aspire to be best supporting cast to the WTO. We understand that they're the ones who go first. It's not a competition. And we don't do the same things. We help them, we support them, we're happy to play a supporting role, but we're also, when we bring out our numbers, for example, on services, we bring out blueprints with the detailed numbers, and basically they whisper in the ear. We give you the graph and say, do you like what you see about yourself? So we give you a mirror and say, look at yourself in the mirror. Do you like what you see? Preferably naked, you know. And if you don't like what you see, is where would you like to, improve the photo? This is our relation with the WTO.
Thank you. Lady there, please.
Hello, I'm Elena Burkle from the Parliament. I would like to ask about this. You referred in the beginning that the productivity growth in the euro area has been extremely low. So there seems to have been a permanent productivity shock to the euro area. And yet the reform seems to be focused more on consumption smoothing and business cycles. And for instance, this European unemployment insurance scheme, that would, of course, ease perhaps a little bit the deficits, but it would still encourage the unemployed to, can you hear me? The unemployed to remain in the region, which is some of, as you said, are very far behind and very permanent in their problems. That would encourage them not to move after work, plus it would, and as such, it could raise long-term unemployment, which would in turn weigh on budget deficits and so the competitiveness problem is not solved with it. It's actually, it may worsen it. So the key issue seems to be how to restore the competitiveness of the lagging regions, and that I have heard very few suggestions on how to solve that. And my question is, do you think that the euro is very much the problem here, as without it this would have been solved 10 years ago, these issues? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I can answer the question on unemployment. I mean, the idea of this scheme is we are not going to change the way people get unemployment benefits. So the incentive will not be different. I mean, they will get what in each country you have some rights you accumulate when you work, and then you get a benefit. The problem is that during crisis, because countries are losing revenue, they may keep either like review this benefit negatively, which happened in some countries. So, for example, they reduce the period in which people could get benefits, which is very bad because in terms of crisis, you should have the time to get a job that is fitting your qualification. You know? If you're an engineer, if you don't want in the long-term growth, we are talking about slow productivity. But if you're an engineer is forced to become a taxi driver, after a few years, you'll not be able to be an engineer anymore. So you want the person that lost a job as an engineer to have enough time to find a new job as an engineer. So that's the purpose of the unemployment benefit. It's very important to keep. And all the government, alternatively, if they keep paying unemployment benefit to people, because they are losing revenues, they will cut somewhere else, they will cut investment, and that's we saw a lot during the crisis that they cut investment, which is also very bad for growth in the future. So the purpose of our scheme is not at all to say, okay, these people will not move. I mean, they will still have the same incentive to move because the benefit will not be permanent and they will decrease over time. So unemployed people will have to find a new job. But what we don't want is like either the government force them to find a new job too fast, even faster than before, or that they cut spending elsewhere that will deteriorate growth in the long term. Like needing investment, and that's frequently what happened during crisis, like government tend to cut investment too much. So.
The question of the moral hazard, which you were mentioning also, I think it's a question of calibration. There are different minimum wages in countries. There are different benefit schemes in countries. And the question is, how do you, as Pierre says, how do you make sure that the country is not cutting on the benefits in the time of crisis, but at the same time, the question of calibrating the benefits of unemployment in order not to discourage the appetite to go and seek employment are quite clear, in the sense that we've been practicing that for a long, long time. I have to say there are still some countries, perhaps even the one which hosting these very important institution in Belgium, where the question of moving from the education to the unemployment was almost a professional move, because because the benefits were quite generous. But I think that has been gradually calibrated so that it is less so. And then there is something else. I mean, there is not just a question of whether you get the same amount of money or not, but being in a job brings with it a quality that is not just the revenue, but also a certain sense of belonging, a certain sense of dignity, a certain sense of ownership, which is not, equivalent to where you get unemployment benefits. But when you're talking about peso by peso or dollar by dollar or euro by euro, the question of not having a moral hazard issue is real. But I find that very, very few countries really are in a situation where you pay so much for being unemployed that you are discouraging people seeking employment. And if that were the case, you should avoid it. You should recalibrate the numbers.
Thank you.
Secretary General Todd Buell from Law 360. You talked about the digital tax a little bit today in your Parliament testimony, and I wanted to press you on that a little bit. You say that there is this report that you're supposed to have done by 2020, and now you're thinking of or wanting to have it done now by 2019, but that would presume that there's a global consensus on this issue, which I don't really think there is right now. I mean, can you explain how this would come about, or how confident you are that there will be a consensus by next year? Thank you.
Okay, this is like when you have a convention of stand-up comedians, and somebody says 18 and everybody laughs, because everybody knows the joke. So maybe just for the benefit of your question, there's a little bit of background. Because this is what I would call an expert's question, and also because you had the benefit of being in the earlier session in the Parliament. What is the issue here? We have been very successful in taxing individuals who had escaped the tax man or tax woman. Why? Because now there are 149 countries, actually 150 countries, that have actually enlisted in something called the Global Forum on Tax Transparency of Financial Accounts. And that means that starting last September, it's on today, 53 countries or something like that started exchanging information automatically. Which means you create an account in a tax haven, or formerly a tax haven, and the bank is now legally obliged to deliver to the authority of that country, and the authority of that country is legally obliged to send to the country of origin of that person the whole information. So your name ends up in the taxman's desk, no matter what. And this September in 2018, in a few months' time, 60 more countries will join, so there'll be nowhere to hide. It means a revolution. It means that you no longer have to send the photo when you were shooting your mother in order to be able to get, the country to send you the information. It also means that if you reported the account that you created in the Cayman Islands or in Panama, or whatever, well, that's fine. You reported the revenue from the interest or the gains from the capital account. But if you didn't, you will be invited to have a cup of tea or to change a uniform for one that has stripes along like that. This is dramatic. And it's so dramatic and so credible that already 92 billion euros, which is about $110 billion, have been recovered by all your collective, including this country and the country next door and the other country and the other country, by the exchequers, by the treasuries. Because so many people have come to say, Mr. Taxman, in the hypothetical case that a hypothetical citizen of this hypothetical country would have created a hypothetical account in a hypothetical tax haven, what could we do about it? Oh, well, I could hypothetically put you in jail or something, etc. So, but maybe you don't want to go to jail. How about a normalization, a regularization period? So they have created these windows of opportunity. Those are the ones who have received 110 billion in revenue, not in disclosed assets. The disclosed assets numbers are 20 times higher. I don't know how many trillions. Just Indonesian money in Singapore, I think was maybe about 300 billion or something like that. So you're talking about huge amounts of money who had been leaving their countries for ages and that are deposited everywhere in the world. And now they're simply saying, well, you had to pay tax on it, didn't you know? Well, please don't put me in jail. The taxman does not want to put people in jail. They want to collect money. Maybe you have, for that, I mean, I was a former Minister of Finance, I'm a former Minister of Finance. Maybe you have to put a few people in jail to prove what can happen if you don't, But, so you choose a very famous football player, a very famous rock and roll singer, a very famous telenovela artist or something like that, and you can almost just say, and they will be liable because nobody pays the taxes in them. So, well, basically, that was some time ago. Hopefully, the morale is better today. But what is happening? This is for individuals. Then, BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting. Multinationals. The potential to raise money every year from taxing the multinational, just having them apply the normal rate of tax to the normal results that they have country by country. When you break down country by country, you can't take everything. No more double Irish, no more double Dutch, no more double this, no more double that, okay? You saw when Margaret Vestager put this fine on Apple for 13 billion, they had paid 0.05%. Not bad. 1/20th of 1% tax rate. Not bad. Huh? So, but then there is the question of the digital. So if you produce furniture, if you produce suits, if you produce shoes, if you produce cars, it's easy to tax you. What if you produce vibrations, photos, whatever it is, it's in the air, and you don't even have to have an office anywhere, which is the basic fundamental. The physical presence leads you to tax. No more need. It can be Singapore, it can be in New York, it can be in Mexico, it can be in Turkey. You just send the products and they're sold and you can do billions without being there. So, how do you tax digital? How do you tax? What do you tax in digital? Where do you tax in digital? How much do you tax in digital? All very relevant issues. Do you apply the so-called, transfer pricing principle? Do you apply the arm's length, which means who is equal to Google? Well, What other comparable Googles are there? What other comparables Apple are there? How are the comparables? What? So basically, taxing digital is a big problem because the way in which we have been preparing to tax and avoid evasion and the avoidance of taxation does not allow us, does not equip us. And at the same time, you're the Minister of Finance, and you're watching your economy, and your economy is 100, okay? And then 10% becomes digital. And that's kind of drifting out of your control. And then 20% becomes digital. 25% becomes digital. 30% becomes digital. And you're not taxing that thing. Then your base is 70% only. Either you're going to have to increase the tax, or you have to do something about the 30%. Why should the 30% not be taxed? The only problem is the 30% doesn't look like anything that is in the books. But they should be taxed. They must be taxed. They make hundreds of billions. They're the 5 largest companies. They're the 10 largest companies, bigger than all the oil companies and bigger than the automobile companies, etc. So how do you go about it? This is at stake. And you are perfectly right. What I said to the Parliament this morning is, I wrote a report to the G20 last March saying, I am writing you with a story about a disagreement. We have not agreed on how we should tax the digital. And the problem, sir, is not taxing 4 companies or 6 companies or Alibaba and Tencent and Baidu in China. It's about taxing an increasingly digitalized world, an increasingly digitalized economy, and which no blueprints, no footprints, and then how do you do this that is fair? How do you do this that is fair to the other competitors? How do you do this that is fair to the other players? And also because to the extent that these guys start intervening in businesses, which the others are doing, and you have the others captive with some perimeters, with some borders, but these guys are in the ether. Big issue. So the European Union put out a directive, 3% on turnover. The Americans are not in the same club, but they're opening up and they have a very open mind in terms of possible solutions. The British went for some imputed, assumed tax level based on total turnover in the UK, which you have to determine more or less, calculation, etc. So basically, you do not have all the instruments that are necessary, and you basically do not have a single view or a single concept, a single criterion on which to tax digital today. This is what is in discussion. Now, you rightly say that they asked the OECD to produce a report in 2020. And you also rightly say, and this is the reality of my misery today, everybody's saying, either you come up with a blueprint faster or I will go my own way. You say, well, listen, I'm only the OECD. You go to whatever your own way, you fix yourself up with the United States, with China, and with Japan or whatever it is. The only problem is that it doesn't work like that because basically, imagine that not all the countries were playing the game of nowhere to hide, that there was still a place that was a tax haven. all the money would go there. Well, here, if you have a place that is not taxing digital, all the digital will go. And also you do that with a click of a button. You don't even have to move any office or anything like that. So the thing is, there have to be homogeneous concepts and legal definitions of what it is that we're trying to. Also, Google is not Amazon. But Amazon is not Microsoft. And Microsoft is not Apple. They do different things. How do you tax them, each one of them? And where do you tax them? And which rate do you apply? This country has higher rates than the United States. So you have somebody to choose. Well, they choose go to the United States. But how does this compare with Denmark? Or how does this compare with France? But in the end, it's about where you make the money. If you do 100 out of France, and 100 out of Germany, and 100 out of Italy, and 100 out of Belgium, then you should tax at the Belgian rate, at the Italian rate, at the French rate, and at the German rate, whatever amount of profit is generated. But the problem is, if you're taxing turnover, then you're not looking at profit. So the whole logic of what the income tax is about is turned around on its head, basically because you don't have the technical elements to determine the profit. So you can see why, dear friends, people are not agreeing. You can see why it's not easy. It's about the right to allocate. It's the allocation of the right to tax. There are some countries that say, I'm universal taxation, therefore bring all the money here, and some others that will say the companies will pay wherever they are. And so basically, it's a country-by-country allocation that you would really want, the breakdown of where you actually make the money that should be done. But how do you determine that? And then how do you discount from the profit whatever the mother company in Seattle or in China or wherever is going to be charging or collecting for intellectual property, for marketing rights, for this, for that. And that has to be reasonable, quote unquote. But then what is reasonable? Who wrote the algorithm? And then who sells the product? But first you have to have the algorithm. If the algorithm was written in Seattle or in New York or in San Francisco, then that is what is going to drive the whole thing. The rest will be, mechanics or economics and marketing. So it's an enormously complex, very frustrating, and sometimes a nightmare job. But as they say in the army, somebody has to do it. And hopefully we will.
Thank you very much. There were some two other questions indicated, but I'm afraid we are over time.
Sorry about that.
So, but I think...
I was to blame.
No. I think we are all impressed by your wisdom and your very clear thoughts and expressing this very complex problem of taxing digital incomes in a very clear and understandable way. So I think everybody benefited from that. So my last job is to thank you very, very much for coming, for sharing your thoughts with us, also for your two colleagues with very interesting discussions, and first of all for all the bright papers that you produce. So I invite all of you to read them. It's really worthwhile to read. Thank you. So please join me and let me thank Secretary General. Thank you.